Hello and thank you once again for joining us here this week at Strange Pathways. I am your host, Scott Mort. I gotta tell you, I've had a beautiful week. I'm getting ready for my first year anniversary. I've been married to the same lovely woman for almost a year now, Ariana. I've known Ariana for 10 years. We dated for about 9 months before we got married. And our anniversary is Halloween, October 31st. So for our first year anniversary, we're going to be heading over to the Grand Midway Hotel in Windsor, home of the world's largest tarot card. They have the world's largest Ouija board painted on the roof of the motel. We're going to be doing an overnight stay, just having a lovely time, taking the ghost tour. The hotel is haunted. It's going to be a blast. I cannot wait to do it. Our first story is going to take us to Paw Paw, Michigan. And this story, it made headlines for a single day back in 1927. Vice President of the United States, Charles Dawes, personally investigated this case. The case of Asbury William Underwood. You're probably going to hear more about him as A.W. Underwood. He had this ability that he could cause something combustible, handkerchiefs, kindling, cloth, paper. If he held it in his hands and blew on it, he could cause it to catch fire. He became known as the human blowtorch. Dawes was fascinated by this and couldn't find any logical explanation. There was a doctor near Paw Paw, Dr. L.C. Woodman. He kept hearing of a young black man who had to be very careful where he breathed in order to avoid setting fires. But, rumors. I think everybody had that one weird rumor around town, the woman that lives here is a witch, or there used to be a guy that sold drugs around town. This was a very popular one in my area of Pennsylvania. There used to be this guy who sold drugs around town, and he had LSD in his pocket. And one day he got caught out in the rain, and the LSD seeped into his skin, and now he's in the mental ward, and he sleeps sitting up, because he believes himself to be a glass of orange juice, and he's afraid if he lies down, he'll spill. I have heard that story so many times. So I can understand how Dr. Woodman was reluctant to believe any of these stories about a black man who had to be careful where he breathed to avoid setting fires. But then one day, A.W. Underwood, he was 24 years old at the time, he walked into Dr. Woodman's office seeking help. Now, this story made it all the way to the Michigan Medical News. In the presence of Dr. Woodman himself and some of his colleagues, Underwood performed some of these feats. In his own words, Dr. Woodman wrote, "Underwood will take anybody's cotton handkerchief and hold it tightly against his mouth while breathing through it. After a few seconds, it bursts into flames. The flames continue until the handkerchief is consumed. He will undress completely, rinse his mouth out thoroughly, and submit to the most rigorous examination to preclude the possibility of any humbug. Yet his breath, blown upon any paper or cloth, envelops it in flames. He can collect dry leaves and start a fire by breathing on them." In later years, there were those that assumed what Underwood had been doing was hiding phosphorus in his mouth. But keep in mind, under amazingly close scrutiny, they stripped the man naked and rinsed his mouth out. And even if you're hiding phosphorus in your mouth, what's to stop that from burning your mouth? This to me is one of the most unique cases, because you have an individual willing to not only come forward and say, I have these powers, but is willing to go through amazing, vigorous testing. The story, though, it reminded me of another story that I had heard years ago. It was almost a different side of the same coin. We're talking about Nathan Coker. He was born in 1814. Another black man. He was a slave belonging to a lawyer named Purnell in Hillsborough, Maryland. Purnell, he mistreated the boy horribly. He starved him. And it was the starvation that led Nathan to discovering his gift. The cook had left the kitchen. Nathan, desperate, hungry, driven insane with hunger, reaches into a vat of boiling water and pulls out a cooked dumpling, pops it into his mouth. And then he thinks he's waiting for the pain to set in. He did this all so quickly. He's waiting for the pain to set in. And it just doesn't happen. He soon finds out that he can touch and eat any food, no matter how hot. One of his favorite things, he would drink the fat off the top of boiling water and down it with scalding hot coffee. In an odd turn, he even said, it's not really the hot foods and liquids that bother me. It's the cold ones. Cold food gave him amazing discomfort. Now, thankfully, Nathan Coker was freed, and he went to work as a blacksmith, which, if you stop and think about it, is the perfect job for anyone who has burn immunity to have. Nathan would reach in and take the iron out of the forge with his bare hand when red hot and not receive any burns at all. In a similar fashion to A.W. Underwood, 2 physicians and 2 newspapers begin to put Coker through an intense amount of tests. They watched Coker take an iron shovel, heat it until it was white hot, and apply it to the soles of his bare feet. Nothing. The shovel is reheated to white hot. Coker runs his tongue over it. Lead pellets are melted, and they're poured into Coker's bare hands. And then Coker takes the lead and pours it into his mouth. Nathan Coker then rolls the molten lead around his teeth and gums until it's solidified. And after each feat, the doctors come in and they look him over. Not a blister, not a burn, nothing. So here you are. You have 2 men. One is a human blowtorch. The other one has burn immunity. Around the same time in history, it could be said these are old stories. These are stories from the 1800s. Now coming up on or surpassing 200 years old. Where are these people today? In New Delhi, though, there is a man named Raj Mohan Nair. When Raj was 7 years old, his mother passed away and he was very depressed. He decided to kill himself by climbing an electrical pole and grabbing a live wire. And nothing happened to him. He can light electric bulbs, he can run fans and blenders by allowing electricity to pass through his own body, and it does not kill him. He can even cook chicken by grabbing a hot plate in his own hands and passing the electric current through his body. He can pass so much electric current through his body that he temporarily goes blind. The electricity actually interferes with the signals in his optic nerves with no ill effects. Just because these stories are old does not mean that they're not true. We have individuals akin to A.W. Underwood, akin to Nathan Coker, living, breathing today. And all we really have to do is look for them. Our next story takes us to the fall of 1969. Author and paranormal investigator Brad Steiger gets a telephone call from an executive in a large Chicago advertising agency. Brad is asked to appear as a consultant at a meeting of an executive from a major airline, some investment counselors, a psychologist, a handful of pilots, and a group of aliens. What did these aliens, what did these non-Terrans, as Brad Steiger puts it, have? They had a powder that transformed tap water into a smokeless, non-pollutant, no-knock fuel, and a liquid that would totally fireproof any surface on which it had been sprayed. Brad Steiger was called in because of the oddness of the situation. Brad has an associate of his, Glenn McWayne, accompany him, and he puts a hidden tape recorder on himself. They meet at a private home, and they begin to look over who they're going to have the meeting with. There was Ray, an advertising executive, whom Brad had met before. Ray was a former jet pilot who had chased UFOs in Korea, and just was absolutely fascinated with him ever since. There was another gentleman named Bill, an executive with a major airline, and just obsessed with solving the UFO problem. And Salvatore. Salvatore was a non-Terran. He was a navigator aboard a UFO. And he had been chosen to negotiate with Earthlings for the fuel base and the fireproofing solution. The meeting commences, and it goes very, very fast. And it was very, very confusing. There was a red-headed lady with strange eyes that Brad never really identified. The lady was very hostile towards Brad Steiger at first. She was complaining that in one of his books, he said maybe some UFOs didn't have the best of intentions towards humanity. They go through this meeting, they get back, and they pull the hidden tape recorder out, listen to the meeting, and everything is intelligible. Brad Steiger himself said it sounded like Donald Duck singing in the shower. A few more meetings take place. They soon find out that Salvatore is not really an alien. He's human, but had been trained by a German scientist who had worked closely with these non-Terrans. Salvatore begins to tell Brad Steiger the story of how he gets involved with this. Toward the end of World War I, there was a Dr. Rhinelander who was contacted by a group of non-Terrans and told that he would be given the plans and assistance to build incredible aircraft that would run on a propulsion system that was completely unknown to him or anyone else on this planet. But if Rhinelander wanted it, he needed to form a group of scientific disciples and go to this certain coal mining community in the Midwest of the United States. Rhinelander agrees. As soon as the armistice is signed, he immigrates right to the city he was told to. The non-Terrans then explain to him why these played out mines, these empty, overworked mines in this area, They were rich in the fuel that they would need for the crafts because one of the fuel's ingredients is a byproduct of coal. So Dr. Rhinelander and his fellow scientists, they start to dig themselves into the community. They start to buy up the old mines in the city. As one mine goes up for sale because it's been picked clean, the scientists come in and buy it. Where did these scientists get the money? Dr. Rhinelander said he was able to buy up old mines to convert them to laboratories by the unlimited funds provided by the non-Terrans. Salvatore then goes on that said that if you want to work for Dr. Rhinelander, you had to first pass a rigorous physical examination, a rigorous psychological examination. You had to be on a special diet, and you need to submit to regular testing of your blood to, and I quote, see if it stayed right. Salvatore's job for Dr. Rhinelander, he was a checker. He would get an address, he would get a name, and he had to go to that place and check to see if that person was doing what they were supposed to be doing. Just as an example Salvatore gave, a computer might spit out a name, and the person with this name was supposed to be living in Orlando, Florida. And they were supposed to be a research chemist. Salvatore would then be dispatched to Orlando to see if that research chemist was living there or if he had made an error and pursued another course of life. Salvatore worked a few years as a checker. And pretty soon he was allowed to enter the laboratories and see what Dr. Rhinelander had been working on. Salvatore said to his eye, they looked like upside-down saucers. Salvatore was working closely with Dr. Rhinelander, so close that he fell in love with his daughter, who was equally as brilliant as Rhinelander was. Dr. Rhinelander had so much confidence in his daughter's intelligence and ability that he permitted her to fly the maiden flight of one of these craft that he was designing. The takeoff was beautiful. But no sooner than the craft was free of the Earth's atmosphere, a larger, similar-shaped vehicle appeared and went over and caught the craft that had been piloted by Rhinelander's daughter. Dr. Rhinelander and his associates are then informed that other aliens, other non-Terrans, had objected to the intervention of Dr. Rhinelander's friends, his non-Terrans. These guys were not eager to have humans flying through space. In fact, they were told that they were going to delay mankind's leap into space to other worlds for as long as possible. We never did go back to the moon, did we? Dr. Rhinelander becomes obsessed, and rightfully so, to master space travel, to negotiate for the return of his daughter. Salvatore told Steiger that 2 more vehicles were lost to the opposing factor of non-Terrans before Rhinelander's team perfected a means of avoiding capture. As of the writing of Brad Steiger's book, Mysteries of Time and Space, Dr. Rhinelander's daughter and the others lost have never been returned. They had been assured that they were being taken well care of on another world. Supposedly, Rhinelander had accomplished space travel in the 1930s, but it didn't really matter to him. He grieved over the loss of his daughter. The unlimited financial funding dried up. At the time of Dr. Rhinelander's death, his group of scientists, once wealthy enough to buy up every abandoned mine in this town and turn it into a laboratory to achieve space travel. They were approaching poverty. Supposedly, they were still in contact with the non-Terrans, who had underwater bases on this planet. What were they to do? Salvatore, he wanted to sell the formulas. Brad Steiger always thought that maybe Salvatore wasn't authorized to sell the formulas. Even though Salvatore said that he was, he always had the air of someone who didn't trust those around him. He had the air of someone being chased, of someone being monitored. You're probably wondering, did the fuel work? Yes. One of the executives had used it in his lawnmower all summer with good results. Another, one of the attorneys at the meeting, used it in his Lincoln Continental for several months, and the motor was still in excellent condition. At one of the meetings that Brad Steiger attended, a jar full of this powder water fuel combination was mixed up and handed around the room. There was little odor. One of them dipped his finger in the fuel and touched it to his tongue. Very little taste, maybe a little bit like kerosene. They poured a little bit out and touched a match to it, and smokeless flame. The fireproofer worked as well. The group went to an airfield, and oil and gasoline had been mixed up and sprayed onto a fuselage, set ablaze. It was extinguished within seconds with one squirt from a fire extinguisher filled with the fireproofer. One of the executives felt he could get backers to raise the money for what the group was asking. But Brad Steiger, he'd heard of things like this before. He knew what was going to happen. Brad Steiger goes up to the executive and says, "I doubt if it'll ever happen. Should you get the backers, I doubt you'll ever get together with Salvatore. And I hope you're secure in your job. In the past, people who have tried to join forces with these characters have often ended up discredited. Scientists have been promised the Nobel Prize and have been awarded nothing but the humiliation of being bounced out of the university with their tenure torn to shreds." There was to be a midnight meeting at a bar where they were to rendezvous with Salvatore. Salvatore was unable to come, but set up a second appointment. Salvatore didn't show up for that one as well. Doesn't it feel like there's a strange game of keep away being played with humanity? Something akin to using a laser pointer to just be amused by watching a cat chase after a red dot that it'll never secure in its paws. In my opinion, we are mistaken whenever we see somebody add powder to water and turn it into fuel. We are mistaken whenever we believe it was some sort of chemical in a fire extinguisher that put out an entire airplane fuselage on fire. There's an old saying that any technology far enough advanced would appear as magic to us. But maybe we need to flip that phrase. Maybe since we live in a technological society, we are unable to view magic whenever we see it, and we mistake magic for tech. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's Strange Pathways. Please go over to the Facebook page. We're going to have a lot of content over there pertaining to this week's tales. If you'd like to get in touch with us, strangepathwaysmail@gmail.com. Especially if you have a story of your own, if you have suggestions for topics you would like me to cover, please feel free to get in contact with me. That email, once again, strangepathwaysmail@gmail.com. Take care of yourselves and each other.